And for our final section, we are thrilled to have Adam Gassin, VP of Global and Strategic Alliances at FutureX. Adam will share his expertise on the automation of encryption for applications and SaaS providers. His session will focus on the technical challenges and the solutions that can simplify encryption integration, making it both seamless and efficient. You'll also learn about the best practices for key management and encryption automation to protect sensitive data at every stage. Let's welcome Adam.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Encryption Consulting Virtual Conference 2024. My name is Adam Kaysen. I'm Vice President of Global and Strategic Alliances at FutureX. And today we're going to be speaking on the topic of automating encryption, a guide for application and SaaS providers. So before we start, maybe just a little bit of an introduction about myself and FutureX. So as I mentioned, I handle partnerships, alliances, strategic initiatives at FutureX, and we are a manufacturer of enterprise HSMs for both general purpose and payment processing, as well as key management solutions, including PKI and certificate authority, data protection, tokenization, file encryption, database encryption, really all manner of data protection across the enterprise. And so a lot of the topics that we talk about today really are going to be woven into that fabric of enterprise data security in general. I know we've had a lot of good conversations throughout the rest of the virtual conference so far this week, and we're looking forward to taking a step back here and looking not necessarily at the ultimate end user of these cryptographic technologies, but rather at the application providers, a little bit earlier in the process there. And what we're going to be talking about today is a guide for how providers of software as a service platforms, cloud services, appliances that you can deploy in your own data centers, in your own networks, and applications in general can incorporate concepts of data encryption and external key management in their applications to protect their most sensitive data and that of their customers. So today we're going to talk about everything you see on screen here. And to begin, we're going to look at the lay of the land a little bit and explore why organizations deploy this type of cryptography in their environments, some of the motivations, some of the decisions around hardware versus software, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the concepts of automating encryption. And to be quite honest, we're going to ask the question and give you the tools you need to answer the question, do you even need it? And I'll go ahead and give you a spoiler alert up front. Not everybody needs 100% fully mature, completely automated encryption. There's a spectrum that we'll be talking about here, and every organization falls in a little bit of a different place. And so part of what we're going to do today is equip you and your teams to make these decisions about what's best for you today, tomorrow, and beyond. After that, we're going to talk about actual steps you can take, tangible things you need to keep in mind, mostly considerations related to the things you see on screen here. User experience, deployment models, technical and business considerations, things that you'll need to take back with your organization, your stakeholders as you go on this journey. And then finally, we're going to talk about the future and some of the things that are coming up from there. And so as we're talking today, be thinking of questions you may have. We're going to be doing a live Q&A at the end of this session. So I would love to get at those questions then and also afterwards as well. Both myself and the encryption consulting team are happy to jump in and answer any follow-up questions, provide details, show some actual demonstrations of the technologies we're going to talk about today in action. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive on in here. So first, we're going to talk about the current landscape. What do we see today? And what have some of the motivations behind deploying encryption and key management in applications, in SaaS offerings, and everything like that? What do those mean? How have those been done? And what do you need to keep in mind? So to start, everybody's seen details about the different types of data protection, data at rest, data in use, data in transit. I can almost guarantee that nobody on this webinar today has not heard of those three concepts before. However, what's important to note here from the standpoint of how encryption is used today is that each of these different categories has some very different mechanisms through which data is protected. And so, one of the important things for you to think about now, and as you analyze your applications and your services and find out how best to incorporate encryption into them, is how is your data managed? How does it move around between different parties involved in the process? How are you securing that data when it's at rest, when it's in use, when it's in transit? And we've got a few examples here of different types of data at rest, a few examples of common attack vectors that are seen for data in use, and similarly, some protection mechanisms for data in transit. Now, for each of these individual categories, you could come up with examples, attack vectors, protection mechanisms. But I wanted to start just very, very broad here and give everybody a sense of the types of things that we look at. And so my recommendation here to begin with, look at your own applications, look at your own environment, and find out for each of these categories, start to make a list. What types of data do you need to protect? What risks do you have? If someone were to try to get to that data, how would they do it? And then what protection mechanisms are there to use? And that point in particular is really where we lead into what will be a lot of the focus today, which are hardware security modules, or HSMs. And again, I know a lot of people on the webinar today are going to be familiar with concepts of HSMs, but just in case anyone's not, to give a brief rundown on these. Hardware security modules, or HSMs, are purpose-built hardware, as the name implies, devices that are tamper-evident, tamper-responsive, and are used to encapsulate cryptographic processing and key management. And the whole idea behind them is that if you have encryption keys that need to be kept secure, they should not be solely in software where someone might be able to, for example, put a keylogger on your laptop or do a memory dump or get physical access to it. Within an HSM, they have a secure boundary, a cryptographic boundary that quite often is maybe memory and CPU encapsulated in epoxy and laced with sensor wires, or other mechanisms. There are tamper wraps that can go around them. Essentially, what these do is provide a physical layer of protection around the environment in which cryptographic processing occurs. So if you look at the slide I've got on the screen here, you see in the bottom left, that little red cryptographic module there. If someone tries to get past that external boundary there, that cryptographic module will automatically detect that. You'll trip a sensor wire there, and it will automatically zeroize all of the cryptographic keys inside it, wipe them all out within a fraction of a second. And so physical security is really paramount with HSMs. They guard against insider attack. They guard against people with access to these devices, in addition to the logical security mechanisms and the cryptographic algorithms that are deployed within them. So HSMs are designed according to some very rigorous standards within the industry. You see a lot of different ones out there, but in particular, we see in the general purpose world, really for all HSMs, you see FIPS 140-2 level 3, now FIPS 140-3 level 3 is kind of the gold standard for HSMs. You also see common criteria for international standards and for kind of a FIPS equivalent in a lot of ways, or at least rhyming. The standards kind of rhyme with one another in a lot of ways. And then in payments, you have PCI HSM, which is a PCI standard used to determine what an HSM that's allowed to be used in payment environments must have. And so why should you use HSMs? Why is it important to use hardware-backed encryption and key management? Well, first off, like I mentioned on the prior slide, there is no stronger mechanism of protecting keys against theft, against physical attacks. In addition to what I mentioned on the prior slide, HSMs are also required to guard against environmental attacks, side channel attacks, and a number of different other attack vectors there. Secondly, improved performance and reliability. When you have dedicated cryptographic processing hardware, it allows you to perform those operations solely within that environment. And so if speed is something where you need a lot of scalability and a lot of throughput in, or if you want to completely separate that out from other systems for purposes of reliability, performance, HSMs really are the way to go. I mentioned compliance mandates on the prior slide, so I won't get into that in a whole lot of detail. And then finally, isolation of sensitive operations. And that is the whole concept here, is you take anything sensitive, any encryption, any digital signing, any key generation or key lifecycle management, and you put that off in an encapsulated area that just has the purpose of doing that. It adds a layer of security there beyond just what you get in software. So now I wanted to look at the overall market, look at some of the trends we're seeing in the industry in 2024, 2025, and beyond. And one of the biggest things that I've seen in working with a lot of organizations around the world who are deploying cryptography and key management into their environments is that there's a real drive and a desire to consolidate these types of environments. Now, historically, when you look at the deployment of cryptography in the enterprise, you saw a lot of fragmentation. You would have one environment maybe for your internal PKI, and then you have another environment, often with different teams, different responsibilities, different vendors to handle database encryption. You have another that handles your firewalls and switches and some of the external key management integration there. You have a whole different group to handle cloud services. There was a lot of siloing of that. And one of the biggest trends I've been seeing is the consolidation of that, where we're seeing organizations have a real drive to stand up, I guess you could call them cryptographic services teams, where rather than fragmenting that knowledge and responsibility and technology across the enterprise, they bring that into a single group that handles the deployment, the management and care and feeding, and the overall life cycle of this technology. So a lot of the topics we're going to be talking about today really play into this trend, and I think they fit very nicely. And when you look at automating encryption in general, that allows organizations to take advantage of this consolidation in a way that's scalable, that's versatile, that's secure. But first, let's ask the question about automated encryption. Do you even need it? And for me, I'm not here today to tell everyone, hey, you have to automate your encryption. In fact, I would say very clearly, a lot of people, a lot of organizations and applications don't need it at least at its most maximum, most mature level. There are a few key considerations that you need to think about before you even get into the details of implementation of this. First off is going to be integration complexity. And that's essentially how easy is it going to be for you to do? And that's thinking from like a development perspective, from a technology perspective. If it's something where for whatever reason it will take a big engineering lift, maybe you want to put it into phases rather than doing everything all at once. And we'll talk about some of those phases later on in this presentation and how you can look at each of those individual ones and decide which are right for you. Second would be user experience. One of the things I found in working with a lot of application providers is that they don't tend to like the HSM portion of the sale. And I say that as an HSM vendor, knowing that it's not always easy. And quite often we run into situations where an application provider, they've convinced their end customer to buy. They love their product, they're ready to go. Where's the contract? Let's sign. And then the customer says, wait, hey, we want to manage our keys in an HSM. And so the application provider has to say, okay, well, here's our list of supported vendors. Go talk to your favorite HSM provider and go through their sales cycle. Come back and tell me when you're done with that. And that takes the sales process out of the control of the application provider and puts a little bit of a speed bump, a roadblock in the way there. And so automating encryption can take away some of those speed bumps in the cycle. And it can lessen some of that impact when previously the customer might have to go talk to a different vendor, and it might kind of mangle up your pipeline tracking and sales forecasting. Automating encryption can help ease that burden and take it away in some instances. Cost is another. And I've got some questions here and some points that you should look at when you're looking at objectives in automating encryption from a cost standpoint. Why do you want to do it? Is it to save money? Is it to make money from a new service? Is it to increase competitive differentiation and give yourself a premium offering that you can provide to your customers. Maybe only in the platinum tier you get native encryption provided by the application provider. Things like that. Those are important questions to ask. Technical capabilities. Essentially, can your team do it? And I think this one in particular is getting easier and has gotten very much an easier thing over the years. There are a lot of standards-based integration methods, and we'll talk about those in a couple of slides from now, that make it a lot easier to implement encryption from a technical perspective. But even so, this is important to consider. And then finally, usage variability. And for those of you who are in the payments industry, you'll know this very well, because typically November, December, you start to see a lot of spikes in retail transactions when you get around Christmas and the holiday season and everything like that. And there are other similar usage spike instances throughout the year in various industries, various times. But if you're in a highly cyclical industry where you have these periods of usage spikes or usage variability, automating encryption and putting in that kind of elastic scalability could ease a lot of those burdens and take away a lot of stress for you and your end customers throughout that process. And before we go on, just a quick reminder here for everybody who's joined in. Please feel free, if you have any questions, drop those into the chat here, and those will get over to us, and we'll be able to handle those during the live Q&A portion at the very end. So now I wanted to talk about some real-world examples and use cases. So where would you see this type of external encryption used? And so I imagine a lot of the people we have on the webinar today fall into one of these categories. And this really is just scratching the surface. I picked 4 categories that I think are fairly common for this, and where you commonly see this type of external key management and encryption. But there are a lot beyond this. And really, when you're thinking about your own organization's services and applications, even if you don't fall into one of these categories, there still may be a real strong reason to deploy encryption. Now, similarly, for those of you who might be attending the webinar today who are not an application provider, who are not a SaaS provider looking at figuring out how to deploy this in your own environment, looking at these different categories may give you an idea of what type of technologies you might run in your enterprise could use external encryption and key management. And that's something to consider also. How can you increase the overall security posture of your organization by pulling in strong cryptography in a lot of these different areas? Now, what technologies are actually used to deploy encryption in these categories? Now, these don't all map out to the exact ones I had on the prior slide. So if those of you are looking at the on-demand version later, if you're looking at the slide deck and you flip back and forth, you won't necessarily see a one-to-one mapping here. But there are a lot of different technologies under the hood that are used for encryption and key management. And these are a lot of the major ones that you'll see here. Now, when you're considering how to deploy encryption and key management within your application or within your enterprise, you don't need to go at this alone. You don't need to look at this and say, okay, that's, 12 or 16 or so different things I need to think about. All right, let's start at one and go over the little rainbow here and figure out all of them. That's not necessary. A lot of these are going to be very, very applicable to certain industries or certain use cases. And we would encourage you to work with trusted advisors, whether it's a vendor like FutureX or whether it's the good folks at Encryption Consulting who have a tremendous amount of experience in this area. Walk with us, walk with your trusted advisors throughout this journey. And especially at the beginning, when you're looking at a massive volume of different use cases, of different technologies, it's good to have some people who've done it before and who know what directions you might be able to take and what pitfalls might be out there. All right, so now we're going to get to the fun part. And this is our guide to automating encryption. So what we're going to do here is talk through a few different categories and a few different things to consider. And on this, I'm not going to tell you exactly how you should do it. On some things, I have some recommendations, but treat this more as a list of considerations, a list of things to keep in the back of your mind or in the front of your mind, talking with your team, with your various stakeholders as you're making some big decisions here. So first off, you need to decide what the encryption journey for your end users should look like. This being the actual people who are purchasing your cloud service, or the people who are purchasing your network appliance, or buying a subscription to your application, or anything else like that. And I've outlined two high-level routes here that you can take. The first one would be the do-it-yourself, the DIY route. And this is what we see quite commonly in the industry today, where organizations want to have a baseline level of support for external key management and encryption, where they say, all right, we are going to support, for example, PKCS 11 in our application. And so any HSM vendor who supports PKCS 11, it's probably going to work. Quite often, the application providers will have certification programs for vendors. That way they can go through and actually test with the HSM or key management vendor and say, yes, we give this our seal of approval that everything works and everything's fine. But at the end of the day, the responsibility for purchasing the HSM, for dealing with the vendors, for managing the care and feeding of that hardware or those cloud services, if they're using a cloud HSM, that falls on the end user. So it's the lowest burden for the application provider. It's the easiest way to kind of dip a toe in the water and start down this journey of encryption key management. But it also can have you run into some of those hurdles and some of those roadblocks in the sales cycle that I mentioned earlier. So like I said, if you're an application provider and you've got a customer 95% closed on a deal, then they surprise you with a desire to have this type of encryption, all of a sudden you're having to say, okay, go off and get your HSM and come tell me when you finish that, right? So there are some upsides and downsides there. The next would be the native or transparent approach. And this is where the application provider handles everything. There are a few nuances to this. And so it doesn't always have to be purely transparent. It can be. I've seen some options where maybe the application provider says, all right, in our application, we support cloud HSM deployments, we support on-premises HSM deployments, we support hybrid, take your pick and do that, and then we'll handle provisioning and managing that. I've also seen others where they completely abstract it out from the end user, and they say either by default or as part of a premium tier or service plan, they say, we've got your data encrypted. We've got the key management lifecycle handled. And that's something that the end user doesn't need to deal with. And so that option, the native and transparent route, is becoming more and more attractive, I've found. And one other thing we've seen is the kind of the hybrid approach, where you might, as an application provider, offer both. And one common way I see this is when you've differentiated your different application or service tiers. What I've found is quite often maybe the free tier or the kind of freeware option offers no external encryption or key management support. You get what you get, and that's about it. And then maybe the middle tier has the ability for customers to bring their own encryption or BYOE and handle that, or bring their own keys, BYOK. And we've actually spoken about that before on a different encryption consulting webinar. So I'm sure that's available on demand if anyone wants to get into the intricacies of BYOE and BYOK. But then the third option, the premium, the platinum service tier for those customers who have more money than they know what to do with, quite often we see the encryption native in there, where the end user is paying the application provider for the privilege of not having to care about it. They have trusted service providers handling the key lifecycle. They still may own their own keys, the end customer. They might want to have control over those, and that's a very important thing. But the actual day-to-day maintenance, handling the availability, the scalability, the disaster recovery and failover, that is no longer their problem. They're paying for the privilege of not having to deal with that. This option, the optional route, also allows users to transition between self-managed and vendor-managed encryption solutions as well. So maybe someone wants to start off with their own HSM that they already have in-house and gradually transition to something the vendor manages. Or we actually often see it in the opposite direction as well. Maybe they want something easy, turnkey, that they don't have to mess with at first, but then as they grow as an organization, the end user, they begin to stand up an encryption services team that handles all of that internally. And so the ability to transition back and forth between those is also important. Now, how these are deployed, we see a few different options, and what we've got here are, I guess you can call it 2.5 different options, where on-premises hardware, someone buys a box and they put that in their own data center and they manage it. They deal with the networking, power, co-location space, everything that goes into the care and feeding of network appliances. That is an option. And that's something where there are a lot of regions worldwide where the on-premises option is still the preferred option. There is something to be said for being able to go into the data center, point at your HSM and say, yes, that's mine. That is where our keys are housed. We know it's there. There's easy access for auditors or assessors, either internal or external, if that's needed, and all that. We're also seeing, and have seen over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, a really, really strong trending towards HSM as a service. And we've seen this at FeatureX heavily on the payment side as well as on the general purpose side. And there are a lot of unique considerations when it comes to cloud HSMs, and that's probably a half-day working session alone on all the nuances there. But for the purposes of today, it's important to note that SaaS and HSM as a service is a very, very popular option. And then finally, hybrid deployments, where you see both. Maybe an organization wants to have their primary HSMs and key management servers on premises, but use the cloud for scalability or disaster recovery and failover, things like that. That's an option as well. And so for you as an application provider or a SaaS provider, you need to think about how you want to allow your customers to deploy this. My recommendation on this, the hybrid approach gives you the greatest amount of flexibility. You are able to do an HSM as a service and have a transparent offering, kind of a turnkey offering for your customers who want it. But then some of your customers who say, no, I will not do that, I need on premises, you still have an option that works for them. There is no right or wrong answer necessarily for whether on-prem or the cloud is the best. I think there are good use cases for both. And so for you as an application provider, if you have the ability to do both, it'll give you the highest degree of versatility and position you pretty nicely from a competitive standpoint against your peer or competitor application provider organizations as well. So now to talk about technical considerations. And for this, I've divided it out into 4 high-level categories, although as you can see from looking at it on the screen here, these really could be subdivided out into probably 7 or 8 others, each in their own right, each of which we could probably talk about for an hour alone. So to start, talking about workload portability and tenant isolation is important. And this is something where organizations who are running as a service offerings that involve HSMs and key management, you need to have your messaging very, very solid as it relates to how keys are segmented. No end user organization is going to want to hear that their keys and their cryptographic processing are commingled with that of another organization. And so there are ways that you can have that isolation between tenants while still running shared or multi-tenant hardware. One of the things that I've seen most common that's the most versatile is HSM virtualization, where within individual physical HSMs, you can logically subdivide them out within the security, the FIPS and PCI boundary, within the security boundary, into multiple virtual HSMs. Each virtual HSM to the end customer would appear equivalent to a physical HSM or a dedicated HSM. It has its own firmware instance, its own security policy, configuration details, throughput allocation. So you eliminate the noisy neighbor problem where one tenant on an HSM could inadvertently kind of chew up a lot of the resources and throughput available to another and effectively cause a denial of service. Virtualization of HSMs prevents that. As an alternate option, application partitioning, where every tenant on the shared infrastructure is under the same major key, the top level key there, but they have their own working keys. Maybe they have their own permissions. They've got IAM policies and role-based access control that can divide out what they have access to and what they don't. Both are options. Virtual HSMs are the kind of the pinnacle in terms of tenant isolation. Uh, Application partitioning also works as well. One thing important to note for HSM virtualization is that it allows a very, very strong degree of workload portability. So if, for example, you're running workloads in North America and you have a client who says, all right, well, we're bringing our Europe region or some other region online, with HSM virtualization, you can put a lot of cool stuff in place as it comes to cloning. So take a snapshot, a clone of a virtual HSM, including keys running in one location, migrate it over to another, hit the go button, and you're essentially ready to scale to that new region. So the burden of scalability is incredibly decreased. PKCS11, Java, KMIP, OpenSSL. A lot of the decisions that you'll have to consider on this would be, are you doing external key management, or are you also doing encryption as well? If you're doing encryption and cryptographic processing, digital addition to just key management, what I've seen is that more application providers use PKCS11 and Java. The ones that are focused a little more heavily on the key management side tend to gravitate towards KMIP. There are a lot of other considerations in play there, though, and that's something that I think for anybody interested in figuring out which one is right for them, I would encourage you to set up a 30-minute talk with myself, with the team at Encryption Consulting, and we can together help guide you on what to select for your application and what's best. There are also vendor-specific APIs as well, and there are upsides and downsides to that too. Quite often it gives you a little more versatility as far as the functionality, gets you closer to the actual HSM itself in terms of processing throughput and speed. But again, that's something we're happy to talk about and to provide a little more detail, maybe in some sidebar conversations. Next up here, high availability, disaster recovery, synchronization, scalability, and cloning. So we talked about some of this where we talked about workload portability and tenant isolation, but we wanted to outline two different options for this. The first would be the hands-on management option. And this is where the SaaS provider or the application provider would actually go in on their own and they would say, all right, we've got a new customer coming on board. Let's spin up a new HSM for them. They would do that. And that's something that we often see when people are first getting started in this field. It's a lot easier to deploy, but it also does take more manual work and record keeping and less automation there. The second would be fully automated using command line interfaces and SDKs provided by the encryption vendor, where within your application, you can say, all right, spin up a virtual HSM, assign it to a high availability cluster, clone it to this other region, increase throughput from 250 operations per second to 10,000 or 50,000 or whatever you want, right? That is the real ultimate goal here for very, very high throughput organizations with a lot of clients using this, because it makes it a lot easier. It reduces the risk of human error involved in manually provisioning and managing HSMs. And then finally, we've got reporting, monitoring, analytics. And this is something that I would venture to say just about everyone on the webinar today is familiar with in terms of general network tools. So I'm not going to dive into it in a huge amount of detail. Just know that this is something that is a very, very important consideration. And I like incorporating this into some external tools, into your SIEM systems, into different log analytics programs, things that'll help you get a better understanding of capacity utilization, of potential scalability needs, and things like that. Now, these are the recommended phases in the automation process that I would look at. And so first, you start out with initial provisioning. And actually, before I get into each of these, I do want to note that these are not necessarily ones that you have to go through all of them to the greatest extent you possibly could. A lot of organizations start out with this initial provisioning step and say, let's take the burden of selecting and implementing an HSM off the end user, and then let's be done. And that's fine. I would say that takes away a good chunk of the pain points for the end user, is just having their vendor source the HSMs, implement them, handle the interconnectivity between their applications, and do that. But for those who want to take it a little bit further, these other three steps, handling the key management lifecycle, so generating the keys, distributing them, managing their revocation policies, and automating that can be a very, very good time saver. And one of the things we'll talk about later in this session is what the CA Browser Forum and a lot of the organizations like FeatureX in the industry are pushing for, which would be reduced certificate validity periods with increased automation over that, allowing there to be greater security, but also with a level of automation that makes it easier to manage at the same time. Managing the key management life cycle, auto manages here, carefully and with automation is very, very delicate. It's something that from an implementation standpoint, you need to be very careful and do a lot of testing in this to ensure that none of the actions you're taking could impact service availability. So this is another thing that we would encourage working very closely with vendors, with consultant partners, with others to help design these policies and how you deploy it. Next would be scalability and portability. I'm going to skip talking about this one in a little bit of detail just because we covered it a good bit on the prior slide. And then finally, wanted to talk about maintenance. So every system, every network attached server, every cloud service has maintenance. Now, how this can be done without impacting the customer is very important. And so, for example, if you are using the HSM virtualization technique that we mentioned on the prior slide, and you're running, let's say, a typical customer who buys your mid-level service plan, maybe you provision them 2 cloud HSMs and you offer them a 99.9% SLA with that. So you've got those split between 2 different data centers, geographically separated. Well, from an automation standpoint, you can set your application up to automatically shift workloads to one or the other, depending on which data center might be going through maintenance, a firmware update, for example, or something like that. And doing that in a way that's seamless to the end user can really differentiate your application and make it easy for them to use. That's what a lot of this is about at the end of the day, is ease of use. So next up, we're going to talk about commercial and strategic considerations. And so the first one that we've got on the screen here is, what degree of automation do you actually need? And I think this is all about the data. I think you need to look very closely at your organization, talk to your customers, find out what their demands are. What are their pain points? Are they running into difficulties around scalability? Is certificate validity management a big concern of theirs? I know a lot of organizations come to us and say, hey, we had a problem with certificate validity and certificate expiry, and how can you help us, right? And that's something we see a lot. And so some of the tools we've put in allow that to be monitored. Looking at these types of things is important when you decide what degree of automation you need. Next up, how is this going to impact your technology roadmap? This is something where, in particular, looking at the prior slide, where you look at the different phases, you should align these along with your roadmap, because your engineering team is doing a lot more than just automating encryption, right? You've got the actual product to focus on. And so what we would recommend is start with the minimal level of support needed. You've got to do that just from a security perspective alone, and that's very, very important. And then look at the other phases and find out, how far do you want to go, and in what order do you want to do those? Next up, what have your competitors done? And what I've seen in this industry, being here for about 15 and a half years myself, is that a lot of application providers in different categories tend to move in herds. You'll usually have a first kind of market leader who will deploy some new technology. Then maybe you'll have the, I guess you call them second to go first, people who still are a little bit ahead of the curve, but want to be cautious as well. And then everybody else runs after that. Well, you need to know where your competitors are at and what they're doing in this area. You don't have to match them one for one. That's not what this is about necessarily. But understanding what they're doing will help you know what questions you might get from your customers. And that way you don't get surprised. And then finally, and I love this one. I think this is a fun one, is how do you monetize encryption? And this is something that, for anyone interested in exploring this in more detail, I would love to do this, because I've seen a lot of organizations and application providers actually have the process of implementing encryption be a net revenue driver for growth rather than a cost center. And as a vendor who's normally in an industry where it's not the case for that, I think it's a cool thing seeing organizations offer value-added services, seeing their end users run to them and say, yes, I would absolutely love to pay for this either premium offering or however you package it up. And so for anybody who wants to talk about that in more detail, I think that's a particularly fun topic. And then finally, it's worth looking at what the drawbacks are to deferring or delaying encryption and key management implementation. So quite obviously, I don't need to say this to everybody here, but if you show up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal due to a data breach because you have not performed your due diligence as it comes to implementing security, encryption, everything like that, that's not good. But everybody knows that. Beyond that, I think looking at your sales cycle, talking to your sales reps and asking them if you currently support external key management, but just with a bring your own encryption type solution. Ask your sales team how that's impacted their deal lifecycle. Has that made their forecasts less reliable? Things like that from a finance perspective are very important to consider. Again, looking at your competitors and what they've done, that's important. And then finally, compliance. This is very, very important for payments, for financial services, for healthcare, for government, for education, for the number of different industries that are impacted by regulatory requirements is growing. And some of the things we're talking about today can really ease those burdens, make it easier to go through the process of complying with them for you and your customers alike. And finally, as we wrap up our conversation here and get ready for the Q&A portion, I wanted to talk about planning for the future. And I've got a few things that you need to keep in mind, or at least that I would recommend you keep in mind. And these are all fun topics, and these are all kind of presentations in their own right here. But the first would be cryptographic agility. So when you're integrating automated encryption and key management into your applications and your SaaS offerings, you need to think not about how we just implement, RSA signing today for invoices or whatever it is you're doing. You need to think about the future. And post-quantum obviously is significant there, but there are always going to be transitions in cryptographic algorithms. A lot of reasons behind that we don't need to get into today, but planning from the start for the need to transition to new cryptographic algorithms and making sure your system and your vendors are cryptographically agile is very, very important. Secondly is certificate lifecycle automation. So when we look at some of the industry trends, we're seeing a gradual decrease in certificate validity periods. I think this is a good thing because refreshing those is important, as we obviously know, but it also creates some burdens on the end user and on the application provider. And so making sure that you're using robust certificate lifecycle automation technology and making sure that that's integrated with your HSM provider as well, very, very important there. And then finally, post-quantum cryptography. And I know there are a few other sessions at the Encryption Consulting virtual conference that deal with this. So I'm going to let them take care of that. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but this ties in very heavily to cryptographic agility, knowing that if you're using conventional cryptography, public key cryptography, that is, you're going to need to transition to post-quantum algorithms within the next probably, depending on who you ask, it might be a year, it might be 2 years, it might be 10 years. My view on it is that we'll probably be somewhere in the middle, depending on the industry you're in. But post-quantum cryptography is incredibly important. It's a very hot topic right now. And the speed at which we've seen the NIST algorithm review process go through, I think is indicative of how important this is. And so this is something to keep in mind as well. And so as we wrap up here, I wanted to lead into the Q&A portion in just a minute here. But before that, I wanted to thank everyone for joining. It's been a pleasure speaking on this topic. It's something that's near and dear to my heart simply because seeing organizations deploy strong cryptography and key management in their own environment and doing that in a way that's scalable, that's versatile, that's secure is fun, And so I would encourage you, if anyone has any follow-up questions, if you're an application provider or a SaaS provider and you're looking to deploy this type of technology, talk to me, connect with me on LinkedIn, drop me an email, connect with your team at Encryption Consulting as well. They do a fantastic job in helping organizations prepare for this and knowing some of the pitfalls and some of the considerations. They work hand in hand with us on this, and we're able to talk through some of the nuances there. Similarly, for those of you who are not application providers, and if you're in that category, I congratulate you for sticking around this long in this presentation. But if you're not in that category and you were looking at some of those use cases we showed near the beginning of this presentation, and you want to know how you can deploy a wide range of encryption technology in your organization, let us know. We're also happy to talk about that as it relates to a lot of different use cases. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the presentation portion of this, and we'll begin the Q&A portion. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Adam, thank you so much for joining us. It's always great to have you. Now let's address some questions, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A panel below. So the first question that I see over here is it better to use HSMs provided by the SaaS or use my own? I believe, Adam, you're on mute. Okay, now I can hear you. I believe there is some disturbance in your end, which is not allowing us to hear you properly. No. We still can't hear you.
Yes, how is that sounding now? Is that a little better?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Wonderful. Well, well, thanks for bearing with me on that. And I guess first, before we get to that question, I wanted to say thank you and the Encryption Consulting team for putting on a great series of events this week. I think it's gone very well here. So to get to that question, which is about how, I guess, whether to deploy encryption and HSMs and external key management and all of that fun stuff from the SaaS provider or from the application provider in maybe a native solution that they're offering, or whether you want to bring your own. You can go either way with that. And I think a lot of that question depends on the organization itself, the end user. So for a lot of organizations that are very large, they have cryptographic services teams, they manage HSMs, they manage key management servers, all on their own already. And so from their standpoint, from a cost perspective, from a logistical and operational perspective, they want to hang on to that, or it makes sense to hang on to that themselves. For others, maybe they want to have the ability to transition between service providers. So, for example, if an organization has a multi-cloud policy where they want to use multiple cloud service providers in their environment at the same time, or if they want to retain the flexibility to kind of pack up their keys and go wherever they want based on their own needs, sometimes they do want to hang on to that on their own. On the opposite side, the same question should be asked of the organizations that maybe don't want the burden of managing cryptographic resources, HSMs, things like that. Either they don't have the expertise in-house, or they're looking to just reduce the amount of overhead involved. So I can't say there's a one-size-fits-all answer for that necessarily. Different things are right for different organizations. So maybe circling back to the original point of the talk here, being for the application providers, for the SaaS providers, I guess that would be an argument almost in favor of allowing flexibility, saying, well, maybe you have an option where organizations can use native encryption inside your own product or service, but maybe you also allow them to bring their own keys or bring their own encryption. And I know I talked earlier about the difference between BYOK and BYOE and things like that, and that's a whole nother topic for another day. But maybe it's a wishy-washy answer of saying, well, maybe both, but it's what I believe. And I think what fits a lot of application providers where they allow as many different options as possible.
Okay, great. Moving to the next question, how can automated encryption fit in my DevOps pipeline?
So for, I guess, focusing on the application providers and SaaS providers here, one of the most important things that we're seeing today is code signing and the ability to have trusted code in your own environment. And so when you're looking at automating encryption functionality, automating the code signing workflow is pretty important. And I know there was a talk earlier this week on that exact topic. And I think when you look at HSMs and you look at, in particular, what we've done in that area, integrating with common code signing tools out there to allow that to automatically happen. It's not something where you have to stop and say, okay, before the release, we have to go and sign the, sign the code and everything like that. It's something that's just integrated in that CI/CD workflow there. And so doing that, obviously there are security benefits to it, but from the standpoint of establishing trust within your customer base, being able to go and show them that and demonstrate what you're doing as an application provider, keeping their security in mind, that's a real selling point as well. So hopefully that kind of answers that question a little bit here.
Yes, it does. So moving to the last question for today, it is, how do you handle regional data residency requirements?
So data residency is a fun topic, especially as it comes to the cloud, because a lot of different regions we're finding have different requirements about what data can and can't leave their country or their region, what's considered sensitive data in the first place. And there's a lot of incorrect information out there, to be honest, that I find, where organizations might want to play it very, very conservatively, because obviously they don't want to run afoul of legislative requirements, right? That wouldn't be good for anybody. But sometimes that results in them assuming that regulations are a little more stringent than they actually are. So one of my first recommendations there, before you start even getting into technology or anything like that, is do the research and find out what the laws actually say. Sometimes that involves just going and looking up the actual requirements. Other times it's a little more nuanced, and in that case, you might want to bring in some specialized outside help for that. But once you do that, you need to determine where to actually run these encryption workloads if there are data residency requirements in place. And so from a cloud perspective, in particular, you can look as an application provider at locking down some of those encryption workloads to certain regions. I know when we spoke earlier today about HSM virtualization, one of the common use cases for that is cloning virtual HSMs across regions. I think I gave an example of maybe a North American company cloning a virtual HSM to one of their Europe sites or things like that. Well, there are certain regions where you cannot do that, right? And so as a service provider, you want to put in some guardrails around that. And quite often the underlying vendor for cryptographic services will have that in place where you can say, all right, we want to allow customers within this region to clone virtual HSMs or clone workloads in general to different regions. Over here, we don't want them to. That's something where, from an application provider perspective, you can either make some of those decisions on your customer's behalf, just make it as easy as possible. Other times you can work that into an onboarding process, ask them questions, make a decision based on where they're located, or just ask them directly, hey, do you want to only have the ability to provision HSMs inside maybe our Europe Central region? Or do you want to be able to do South Asia and Africa and South America, everywhere else, right? That's a decision to make as part of that phased approach we talked about earlier. What do you want to do there? Because it's really a wide open playing field there, but there may need to be some guardrails around it, depending on your own requirements and those of your customers.
Okay, perfect. So that concludes our Q&A session. Again, Adam, it's really great to have you with us, and a very big thank you to our audience for joining us. It was great to have such an incredible lineup of speakers like Adam and an engaging audience that supported us throughout these 2 days. As we close, we're excited to keep this connection going, and we hope to see you at a future event. Thank you once again, and here's to more conversations ahead. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you very much.